Welcome to Into the Mind of Gen Z, a podcast where I take a look at scientific studies discussing the unique challenges and identity shifts that Gen Z goes through and what the science says about how it affects our mind. Hello, my friends, and welcome back to the podcast. My name is Marco Mai, and today I am so happy to be back after my short break to be talking about Gen Z and beauty standards. I believe that beauty standards today have really shifted the way that we tend to approach the world. In kind of a society where we have to use social media a lot, we talk a lot online, we see people a lot more often, at least on these screens. Beauty standards are a really big part of what we do and how we actually basically communicate with each other. Looking beautiful or looking good is something that basically everyone wants for their own reasons. We have a lot of research that obviously indicates that people who look better are going to get treated better. And we'll get more into that later. But we also have other things, which I think gets a little bit more into the core of Gen Z right now, which is the idea that beauty is also self care. And it's a way of promoting your own self confidence in finding ways to look good. Obviously, this is kind of nuanced because for Gen Z, it's not as simple as just looking good and always caring for yourself. As I was talking about earlier, social media plays a pretty big role in this. It's not something that all of us just want to suddenly get plastic surgery or get Botox or do all of these things just for a self care measure. Again, there is nuance. It's not like everyone who does it is a bad person or that they're not caring for themselves. But as we'll talk about today, this is a very meaningful topic because it talks about how authentic we are in our daily world and what beauty standards really mean for us. So, if you're excited and how we'll be talking about this and looking at the research behind beauty standards, Gen Z, the aesthetic market, men and women, and how we're affected, then stay tuned because we're just about to dive into the mind of Gen Z. So, the first thing I want to kind of talk about is the aesthetic market and Gen Z beauty buying behavior. As you may or may not know, Gen Z is typically a lot more liberal in their spending of their money. Whether it's people who come from wealthier family backgrounds who have more money to spend, or it's people who just generally feel that they want to spend their more money because they're in their 20s and they want to find ways to enjoy this period of their life, Gen Z does splurge on products, and that includes beauty products. So McKinsey actually has done a study and they found that Gen Z is widely propelling the growth and masstige, aka the prestige for the masses, in beauty segments. Gen Z in general is willing to pay much more for beauty products from sustainable brands, from brands that do better, from brands abroad, and high quality beauty products in general. And they are willing to spend a lot of money on these beauty products. This is actually a pattern that we also saw in millennials, but the reason that Gen Z is so interesting is that not only are people trying to spend money on high quality products, but they're willing to promote it more. And again, this comes with the advent of social media. Beauty brands who want to sell really high end products find success because they can justify those higher prices to Gen Z. And then Gen Z, they are really on social media. They like talking about these things. And really importantly, Gen Z is really open about their beauty standards. We're going to talk a little bit more about that when we get to the plastic surgery standard. But in general, Gen Z has this mix of wanting to actually help people, but also just sharing information in general and trying to get information correct. We are often called the internet natives because we are born around the internet, and a lot of that comes with always trying to confirm the knowledge that we have. In fact, that's kind of exactly what this podcast is about. It's about confirming knowledge. And what we see is that Gen Z really likes to spread knowledge that's helpful. They like to spread brands that are helpful or things that help to them. And that's how we kind of get these beauty brands that can sell at a premium product. In this wellness space, consumers are looking for those science backed and clinically proven ingredients. And so that applies to all of our beauty subcategories, including aesthetics, so like sun care, cosmetics, hair care, skin care, and so on and so forth. On a personal note, I'm actually also pretty deep into skincare. If any of you want like skincare recs or anything like that, then you can come to me. I'm happy to help. But we also see this across a lot of Gen Z. So 45% of Gen Zers actually say that they try beauty brands every 2 to 3 months. And 60% say that they're willing to keep buying products from their favorite brands. But one of the main things I wanted to take away from this specific survey is the idea that it's men who are also contributing to the purchasing of beauty products. As I said, I'm one of these men. And in that specific survey, they found that it was mostly East Asian men, around 3 in 10, were the ones who were purchasing much more aesthetic and beauty products. But we are also seeing a general rise and an increase across men in general, whether it's in the UK or the US. I think this is something that's really interesting and really cool. And I actually think is a good thing in a lot of ways. I am not a woman. I'm not going to speak on women's behalf, but I will say I think it's pretty clear that women have had much higher beauty standards over the years. And I believe that in more recent times, men have been starting to also feel that pressure as well. And not necessarily, I want to say, in a super bad way, which again, we'll talk about a little bit more. However, we have been seeing a more push towards that kind of millennial aged idea that you want to take care of yourself for the sake of your wellness and your beauty, to feel confident in yourself, because it's not just about looking good, but it's also about feeling good. I think that this is one of the things that I learned really early on, is that makeup is a lot less about the idea of trying to look good for others, and it's more about looking good for yourself, because then that gives you the confidence to do things like go outside, like sharing yourself, like talking to other people, and really promoting your personal health and your wellness. I think this can get backed up really well by this study, which was done by beautymatter.com. And so they took a study from around 2,000 US teenagers and young adults aged 14 to 22. And they found that a lot of teenagers felt the pressure to look perfect and that they had really high standards for themselves. And one of the really big issues for this is that there's a lot of people who are uncomfortable sharing their bare face on social media. People feel the need to use a facial filter. They want to use makeup a lot. They are anxious to even go back to school. They found that nearly half of young Americans were anxious to return to school this fall. As I said, this is a very integrated topic, but what I really want to point out is just how your appearance can really have such a strong impact on the way that you view the world and how you view yourself. And this is probably why we see that millennials and Gen Z are so open to this idea of pushing for wellness and pushing for general beauty standards and self care, which I think is a good thing. Again, speaking from a personal perspective, is that I do feel better when I take care of myself. When I was a teenager, and I still do actually have moderate to mild acne, but when I was a teenager growing up, I had very severe acne. And I remember that it was a really big cause of my insecurity, and I really didn't like it that much. Even though a lot of people will say things like, people aren't paying attention to you that much, people are too worried about themselves, and those things are true, it doesn't detract from the fact that you might still feel bad about yourself. And in that scenario, it's good that people now are taking the proactivity to actually push themselves and change and actually become more confident in themselves. But now, this is where I think beauty standards can get dangerous, because we're starting to see that we actually prioritize it as a sense of wellness, as a sense of self care. But then, what does that mean when we see someone who doesn't do these things, right? As I said, 3 in 10 men in East Asia use skincare products or aesthetic products and those kinds of things, which is good, good for them. But then what about the 7 in 10 in East Asia? And even though we don't have the exact numbers now, it's even less in the US and the UK. They say it might be 5 or 10%. And again, even if those numbers are growing, it's still probably not that many people. And so, how are those people viewed now? I think that we tend to have the tendency that if we believe that skincare and doing these things and grooming yourself and looking good is for self care and your wellness, When you look at someone who's not doing that, you tend to look at them poorly. This, I think, was especially true when we got to things like body image. And so people who tend to be on the heavier side might be seen as someone who is lazy by default, that they have issues, that they're not pushing themselves, especially if they're unhappy with themselves, for example, that they are not actually doing things for themselves. And that is a reflection of their character, right? I think that this is an unhealthy way to look at it. As we know, body image is very, very important in terms of how we see our mental health. A study done in 2023 looked at body image as a global mental health concern across a ton of different continents and countries. So they looked at high income speaking countries like the US, European countries, Latin America, Asia and Southeast Asia, and the Middle East, and even Africa. And what they found was across all of these countries, literature has highly suggested and highlighted that it's very common that there is a global level in terms of appearance ideals. And the nature of these body image concerns can actually be a major mental health issue. The perpetuation of needing these and trying to always hit these really, really high standards is just really poor for your mental health, especially in the westernized media exposure. That's what they found across all of these 26 or so countries. And so, this is where we can see body image and beauty standards and these things begin to overlap and become, quite frankly, very, very difficult to manage. Again, bringing up social media because this is what is talked about in terms of media exposure for these studies, is that we always see these people who are super beautiful, who have all of the features that we might want, whether it's a guy, whether it's a girl, it doesn't even matter who it is. They're typically a very beautiful person, right? They're going to have clear skin, they might be tall, they have beautiful hair, they're dressed well, they're usually thin. If they're a guy or a girl, they can be really well toned. They have all of these really good looking features, and that can make us feel poor about ourselves. And part of this is really sad and difficult because the reason we see these people is because those are the kinds of people that we also just tend to like. Those are the people that when we scroll on our TikTok or our Instagram, we like or we comment on those photos because they look good. And that perpetuates them further in social media because, yeah, if someone's going to look good, then they're going to go further. And this is also what I was talking about before, where people also care about appearance because they know, and it's very open fact that looking good gets you further in life. I think this is especially true in terms of social media, as we see. And if you want, I mean, just go on your Instagram or go on your TikTok and look and see if you can find one person who is even remotely somewhat bad looking. You might see someone who is maybe a little bit less conventionally attractive than somebody else. But in general, you'll very rarely see someone who you would call just straight up ugly. And what we would call this in psychology is something known as the beauty premium phenomenon. And this came from Dosinger in 2019 and basically talks about how when you are more beautiful, people are just treated better. They found that even in childhood, kids who were considered cuter would be treated more favorably. They would have people take care of them more. People would react faster to them. And you'd see all of these benefits. Some of the crazy ones that I found out is that people who are good looking are less likely to be judged as guilty in legal and courtroom settings. And that is very crazy to me. This is why a lot of people say that if you show up to a court or something, and if you're on case, which hopefully, if you're listening to this, none of my listeners are going to be on a case of being guilty on something. But if you are, you want to show up and you want to look good because you make that implicit idea that, oh, this person looks good, they look put together. This gives them an advantage and they're less likely to be guilty in that situation. There's also very obvious advantages to looking good when you're trying to be in a relationship or looking for a relationship or dating or anything, but that doesn't have much to talk about. But we will talk about dating and appearance a little bit later. I will say though that sometimes there is a little bit of an overstatement in terms of people who are looking good and good looking people live life on easy mode. Well, I think it's true in general, as we can see based on the research, that people who look good do tend to live easier lives. It also doesn't come with its own offsets. So, for example, when you look at the research on the dark side, quote unquote, of being good looking, then there are some issues. So, for one, there might be envy related hostility. So, while it's true that people who are better looking generally are more liked by the opposite sex, the reverse can also be true for people of the same sex. So, Eichtha and others in 2010 found that good looking students are more likely to be socially excluded or bullied by those of the same sex. And this comes from the idea of envy. When people think that they look good, they might bully those people. And this even happens in workplace settings where people who are good looking employees face a greater level of hostility from colleagues and superiors of the same sex. Even more than that, physically attractive candidates they found are typically less successful in job interviews with interviewers of the same sex, and it's believed to be because they are seen as a threat. I think this is really interesting because what this goes to show you is that even though you might have a better time in the dating world, in other situations, it can kind of play against you. This is a little bit of a tangent, but I think that this is kind of an unfortunate reality of our current world is that people are really willing to be judgmental to others and say that they're ugly or, oh, you're better than them or any of these things and really find a way to pit people against each other. This isn't to say that you shouldn't complain or that you can't complain or you can't be a hater or any of those things. But I think that there's kind of an innate idea within a lot of people that they need to compare themselves to others or they need to compare others to themselves. And this creates this hostility between us when in reality, typically most people aren't that mean. But even with these somewhat negative side effects, we do see in general, people who are attractive will be seen as having good positive traits. They're going to be more likely to be seen as intelligent or healthy and kind. And in general, it's going to help push their life forward. So there is an idea that looking good does benefit you in your life in general. But this is where we can start to take things to the next level. And this is going to be specifically mostly talking about surgical treatments or plastic surgery and other cosmetic surgery that you can be doing for yourself. And so for Gen Z, people overall see that we are a lot more open to the idea of individuality and self expression for cosmetic procedures. And I think this is pretty true in general. If you ask some of your friends, and for me, if I ask my friends, a lot of them are going to say, like, hey, if you want to get a rhinoplasty, if you want to get fillers or whatever, you do you, right? We're happy for our friends. We're happy that they're trying to figure out a way to do things for themselves. And I think that is a good thing that we allow other people to do what they want to do and be happy. I think that this generation generally does a good job of doing inclusivity when it comes to beauty. And I think that's a good thing. But again, one of the issues is when does that beauty and when do these standards get too far? And so, what we actually see is that in the research, Gen Z is kind of dominating the aesthetic and plastic surgery market. So, 75% of facial plastic surgeons reported a spike in demand from clients under 30 in 2023. And one of the issues with this is, again, people are really open to actually getting surgical treatments. And I'm all for people getting aesthetic treatments and feeling better about themselves and becoming more confident. But I think that part of the issue here is now when does it get to the point that it is unrealistic? Something that really stood out to me in this one article that I was reading by Dr. Tim Pierce is that there's a lot of stigma behind getting older or not looking beautiful. So, this specific comment was that someone said, I am getting older, I am falling apart. I am trying to keep it together and maintain my looks for a little bit longer. And they're defending their choices of getting these lip fillers and these Botox treatments because they want to look younger and they want to feel good about themselves. And that's fine. But I think one of the issues is that this also implies a very negative look at aging and people who are older in general. I think this is super interesting. And this was also my undergrad research that I'm working on publishing. So I get to nerd out about this a little bit. And what we do see is that people who are older, or when you look at people aging, there is a very negative attitude towards that now. And it's actually gotten stronger than before. And you can kind of see it in the media, right? I want to specifically talk about things like anti aging products, right? When you buy something or when you do something, it's about not aging, it's about looking younger, it's about being complimented to look younger. And those are really big pushers towards trying to make sure that you stay young, make sure that you stay beautiful because you're young, right? To younger people, those aesthetic treatments mean something. And in this case, when it becomes about age, it can become a status symbol because you don't want to look older. In my specific study, what we really found, which was interesting, is the effect of age on the perceptions of warmth and competence, specifically for East Asian individuals. And so typically within the research, what we would find is that people who grow older might have an increase in warmth over time. And so what that means is that if you think about kind of like an old grandma, right? You might think of them as getting a little bit less cognitively fluent as they get older. And so that means that your perception of their competence reduces. However, when they get older, you also see that their warmth increases, right? You think that they get a little bit calmer, that they're more caring. The really classic stereotype is when you look at an old woman and they bake cookies for you or they really help take care of you whenever you visit them. However, what we see in our research, or my research at least, was that we don't actually see this pattern for specifically East Asian people. And so East Asian elders are actually seen lower on all dimensions, on both warmth and competence. And while this might have some things to do with race, I also think that it might have something to do with, in general, the idea of age, right? So we get back to this idea that people, when you look at social media, when you look at things that people want to buy, when you look at the people who you're going to take lessons from, right? People take lessons from influencers and YouTubers. A lot of them are not people who are much older. And so we have a much poorer idea of all of these older people. And I think it also, in part, actually, maybe just thinking about this, has to do with some of the wealth divide. People in my generation, I know, have felt really distraught and kind of betrayed, I would even say, by people in the older generation who have sucked up a lot of wealth and have made it really difficult for us to live our lives in terms of things like housing costs or whatever. Anyway, that's really tangential, but the main thing I want to say and the main point I want to get across is that it seems Gen Z has this kind of innate push to not wanting to age and thinking that aging is the enemy, and even older people are the enemy. So as a result, people are more likely to get these things like fillers, like treatments, and get all of these aesthetic treatments. I think that something I really wanted to talk about is also the influence of East Asian media on this kind of thing. So, specifically, this is going to be mostly targeting South Korea because I think South Korea is the one that gets the biggest flack of this. I also actually think China is a very big issue with this, but a little bit in a different sense, and I'll separate them here. And so, one of the things with Korea is that they are really big on beauty standards, right? Korea is really well known for their skin treatments, for getting plastic surgery, for enhancing the natural look of people. And they really care about how they look. I think it's actually one of those things, it's really common that when people, I think women especially, when they become 16, they very often are going to get double eyelid surgery because they are now legal to, and it makes them look better and it makes them feel good about themselves. Again, that's perfectly fine. But I think that part of these things is that it's pushing this idea of what is the ideal person that you can be on social media. And it fills everyone else with the idea that, oh, I have to look like this or I should look like this. I think the a special globalization of specifically K-pop, actually, and these Korean models and these people who are genuinely very beautiful and they look very good has also kind of given people a false idea of what they can or they should look like. I'm personally not on TikTok, but I know that on TikTok there have been a lot of issues revolving around this kind of area. It was actually largely K-pop and the popularization of it that started the trend on TikTok about a race change. People who wanted to literally be Asian, people who were getting surgery so that they could get double eyelid surgery and things like that. And that is just an example of how beauty standards can be really negative when they're perpetuated in such a bad way. Korea also is really open to getting plastic surgery. So things like rhinoplasties or nose jobs and all these other Botox and fillers are pretty common amongst a lot of idols. I believe that there's this one group, I don't remember if it's SM or if it's Hybe, but apparently there's this thing called like the Hybe nose, which basically means that a lot of idols who are under this specific content group have a very similar nose because they have the same plastic surgeon who does their nose. And that's just an example for how many people do these things. And to be fair, for these people, it is their livelihood, it is their job, and looking good does bring in the money. So I'm not going to hate on them or tell them that it's wrong or even tell you that it's wrong. But it's just an example of how accepting we are of all of these plastic surgeries and how it's starting to bleed into our world, people getting into plastic surgery themselves. On the other hand, China, and I'm Chinese, so I know a little bit more about this, is kind of unique because I believe the main thing with China comes from the idea of filters and AI and makeup. So if you use the platform called Xiaohongshu, you're going to actually see a lot of content about glowing up, about fixing things like your nasolabial lines, about all of these insecurities that you probably had no idea that you had before. Honestly, I would not recommend going on it if you're like someone who is really insecure about their appearance or you feel like you could become insecure about your appearance. But on that platform, you're going to see a lot of content curated between this idea of how can I make myself look better? And what I want you guys to recognize from this is that these beauty standards are just incredibly unrealistic. In one case, it's about getting Botox or cosmetic injectables or reshaping your bones to look the best way that you can. And in another place, it's about using filters or using AI or using a ton of makeup and acting like that's how you look every single day. Again, I am not pushing for people to say we shouldn't do plastic surgery at all, or say that we shouldn't do makeup, or that we shouldn't use filters or whatever. Doing these things to make yourself feel good and feel confident in yourself is okay. But the issue is that when it gets perpetuated onto media, and now this is what a lot of people think that they should look like. And suddenly, people are a lot more caring about their appearance, and this drives them to get these aesthetic treatments. A really interesting theory I heard from Dr. Tim Pierce is the idea that a few hundred years ago, we very rarely actually looked at ourselves. So people would mostly look at themselves in, the mirror, or if you go even further back, the water. Now we have digital cameras and smartphones, and people take pictures of themselves, take selfies of themselves, and you also see things like FaceTime and Zoom and taking classes and showing your face online. And people are now more than ever looking at themselves and taking note of ways that they could look better. And the issue is, and now as well, we're not just comparing ourselves to a smaller social group. Again, pre social media and pre phones and smartphones, most of the people that you saw were only the people that were in your immediate vicinity. Now, and this is why I brought up East Asia, you can see people across the globe and you can start comparing yourselves to them, right? My competition as a male Asian man apparently is like Jungkook or something, even though he has like 3 inches on me and is a lot more beautiful and a lot more rich than me. That's kind of what my comparison point can be now because of social media. And think about that. Is that not kind of absurd? This globalization of beauty standards can be really difficult for people to overcome because suddenly their standards have to get raised. We now spend an average of around 2.5 hours per day on social media. And most recent, not yet published studies suggest that that's a actually low estimate, depending on your age range. And again, for Gen Z, who are people who are typically online more than the other generations, maybe not more than Gen Alpha, it's probably more. It's probably closer to 3 or 4 hours, even 5 hours per day. And a lot of that time is going to be spent looking at these beautiful people. It's going to be looking at these influencers. And suddenly, not only do you compare others to those people, but you also compare yourself to those people. As I prefaced this episode out with, I think beauty standards can be a good thing. The idea and that core tenet where it's about wellness and about confidence and about really leveling yourself up for the sake of yourself, I think is a wonderful idea. The concept that people should go to the gym, that people should work on themselves, that if people aren't happy with how they look and they're not confident in themselves, that they can do something about it is healthy. It gives you a sense of control. And as we know, that sense of control over your own life and especially the way you might internalize your beauty is a good thing. However, the issue comes from when we start using social media and we start comparing ourselves and people in our lives to these idols, to these influencers, to these really beautiful people that we might never be able to compare to. This is going to bring me to the last thing I was going to talk about today, which is the idea of your looks and how it affects your dating. I actually wasn't going to talk about this in this episode, but I got reminded of something really kind of unique from someone who was just talking about this. And it was the idea that 90% of women want 10% of men, right? And I've heard this statistic so many times. I've heard even women say it to me a lot of times. And so I decided, it's time for me to take some research and actually look at this. Like, what is actually going on behind this? Because there's no way that's true. And I'm very happy to say that is pretty much not true, but there are actually some caveats, which we'll get into. So, after some digging, I found what I believe to be the start of all of this discourse. And what it was the idea that OkCupid did a study and they found that women found around 80% of men unattractive, right? This study was done several years ago, and it's actually a very interesting study because they talk about things about how, for example, 2/3 of male messages go to the top 1/3 of women, and all of these other things about messaging and what is the most attractive approach to messaging and blah, 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 blah. But this is a very old study. This was done in 2009. There is some other statistics and some other things about anecdotally how people are like, oh, I only want to talk to like a 6 foot man, or I want to talk to someone who is this height, or they make this amount of money, blah, 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 blah. I think that that kind of discourse and these things happening online, plus this study, led to this idea that it was like, only around 10% of men, I actually don't know the exact statistic, but not that many men are 6 foot and over, right? Plus, when you look at data like this, which suggests that women do not see that many men as attractive, then I think that's where this kind of false statistic came from. But again, I'm here to break down this study and tell you that it is not true. And specifically, one, it happened in 2009. This happened very, very long ago. Two, this is on a dating app where obviously you're going to try to perceive people as attractive based on how they look. Three, the OkCupid in 2009 was very much just on the West. It was very much a white population and doesn't really reflect, I'd say, the more multicultural culture that the Western civilization has grown into. And lastly, four is something I want to talk about is that women tend to develop attraction over time. And so I've talked about this before on this show, but we do have research that shows that women tend to care a lot more about the mental stimulation. And so this is why women read a lot of things, and especially erotic things, whereas men care a lot more about the visualization of things. Obviously, that isn't to say that neither cares about nothing. I get very mentally stimulated by certain things. I know a lot of women who also really much care about how their partner looks, and that's perfectly fine. But what that is to say is that there is a slight lean towards what you might find attractive. And so if you give women this idea that, oh, I have to just look at this list of men and I have to pick out the best ones, they're going to pick out the best ones, right? They're going to pick out the ones that look good to them. But developing true attraction and care for someone goes way beyond the looks. And this goes for both genders. It's about actually knowing the person and learning about them and caring about them. Yes, while beauty standards are there, typically you're not going to see the relationship that is going to just only come from physical attraction succeed. And this goes for every single relationship, not just romantic ones. And I think this is a key point that I will try to end this episode out on because I like to end it on good notes is that if you care about your beauty and your beauty standards, very deep down, I think that a lot of people tend to do it for themselves, But there's also a component, of course, of wanting to be liked by other people. But I want you to recognize that people who really like you and people who want to stay with you are not going to like you only because of how attractive you are. They're going to look at you and they're going to like you because they like that you work towards trying to look good, that you're confident, that you're fun to be around, that you have interesting hobbies, that you're fun to talk to, that you have a lot of emotional vulnerabilities, that you're social. And these are the things that put you together as a person that makes you enjoyable. And so, even if you're going to do these things, you're going to get plastic surgery and you're going to care about yourself, then do it safely and do it for yourself. I know this episode might have been a little bit messy and it's probably sounded a little bit different from my regular episodes. As I said in my interlude, I'm still working on my paper. I just finished up some editing, so I wasn't able to get all of the firm research out on this one. So I'm sorry if it was a little bit messy. Maybe I'll do a remaster of this episode in the future. But if you still enjoyed, or if you enjoyed this kind of format, which was really loose research, then let me know. I'd love to hear your feedback. If you enjoyed it and you're thinking of someone who really cares about how they look and might want to listen to this, then please do share it with them. If you could leave a review, that's always appreciated. I appreciate your support. And also leave me a message if this was something that really resonated with you. I love doing these episodes just because it always gives me a chance to learn more about different things and also talk to people who have different experiences. Often in a podcast, you don't have the chance to actually get critically challenged because I'm the only one talking. And so I'd love to hear from you guys if you guys want to challenge anything that I said, want to learn more about the research, or just have a talk. So, with that said, thank you all again so much for listening in this week's podcast, and I will see you again next week.